When I first moved into the neighborhood, I believed I had found the perfect place to settle down. The houses were neat, the lawns manicured, and the streets quiet enough that I could hear the birds chirping in the mornings. It seemed like the ideal environment to build a life in peace. Most importantly, it was a place where my best companion, my golden retriever named Max, could enjoy the open spaces and fresh air. Max wasn't just a dog to me, he was family. I had raised him since he was a tiny ball of fur, and over the years, he had become my closest friend. He was loyal, gentle, and intelligent. Children in the neighborhood adored him, and he loved them back. Whenever we went on our evening walks, kids would run up to him, wrapping their arms around his golden coat, while Max wagged his tail like he was the happiest creature alive. Neighbors often commented on how well-behaved he was, and more than once, someone had even joked that Max was friendlier than most of the humans living there. For the first few months, everything was calm. My mornings began with Max sitting by my feet as I sipped coffee on the porch. In the afternoons, he'd chase a ball across the yard or nap under the shade of the oak tree. Life had a rhythm, simple and comforting. I took pride in maintaining my property, keeping the yard clean, and following the community rules. I had no idea that trouble was already brewing just around the corner. At first, the HOA president, Mrs. Carter, seemed harmless. She was an older woman, always dressed sharply, with a clipboard tucked under her arm. I would see her walking briskly from one house to another, pointing out weeds in someone's flower bed or a slightly crooked mailbox. She carried herself with an air of authority, and people in the neighborhood either respected her or avoided her. When we crossed paths, she would smile thinly and greet me, but her eyes always lingered on Max. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she wasn't a dog person, I figured. Not everyone was. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that her gaze wasn't just casual, it was calculating. One evening, as Max and I returned from our walk, Mrs. Carter stood at the end of her driveway, clipboard in hand. She didn't say anything, but her eyes followed us the entire way back to my house. Max wagged his tail in her direction, trying to win her over with his usual charm, but she didn't even blink. That was the first sign something was wrong. Back then, though, I brushed it off. After all, why would anyone care about a dog who didn't bark excessively, never damaged property, and brought nothing but joy to the neighborhood kids? To me, it was unthinkable that Max, my loyal companion, my family, could ever become the target of anyone's anger or authority. But I was wrong. Very wrong. What I didn't know was that Mrs. Carter wasn't just disinterested in dogs, she was determined to ban them from the entire neighborhood. And Max, my sweet golden retriever, was about to become her first target. It started with a letter. One bright Monday morning, I opened my mailbox expecting the usual stack of bills and advertisements. Instead, tucked neatly in a white envelope with the HOA's letterhead, was a notice addressed specifically to me. I tore it open casually, not thinking much of it, until I read the words inside. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you are in violation of the community guidelines regarding pets. Effective immediately, you are instructed to remove the animal from the premises or face fines as outlined in Section 14, Article C of the bylaws. I must have read the letter 3 times in disbelief. Remove the animal? The animal in question was Max. My dog. My family. And this so-called bylaw they mentioned, I had skimmed through the HOA rules before buying the house, and nowhere had I seen a clause banning dogs. Confused and irritated, I folded the letter and shoved it in my pocket. Later that afternoon, I spotted Mrs. Carter, the HOA president, standing in her driveway, clipboard in hand as usual. Her posture was stiff, her chin raised, as if she were waiting for me to approach. So I did. Mrs. Carter, I began, holding up the letter, I think there's been some kind of mistake. I got this notice today, but pets are allowed in this community. Aren't they? She gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Pets, yes. But dogs over a certain size? That's debatable. And frankly, your animal has been causing concerns. I blinked at her. Concerns? Max hasn't done anything wrong. He doesn't bark all night, he doesn't damage property, he doesn't bother anyone. Her eyes narrowed. I've had complaints. From who? I pressed. That's confidential, she snapped, clutching her clipboard closer to her chest. But as president of this HOA, it is my responsibility to enforce the rules, and I will not allow this community to go downhill because of irresponsible pet ownership. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Irresponsible? Max was cleaner and friendlier than most people in the neighborhood. But one look at her rigid stance told me this wasn't about logic. It was personal. Over the next week, the notices kept coming. Each one grew harsher in tone. First it was a warning, then a final warning, and finally a threat of fines. She even sent me a printed picture of Max sitting in my yard, circled in red ink like he was some kind of criminal. Neighbors began whispering. Some were supportive, telling me they loved seeing Max on walks and thought Mrs. Carter was overstepping. Others avoided me, clearly worried they'd be next on our radar if they took my side. It became obvious Mrs. Carter wasn't just enforcing rules. She was obsessed. Her eyes followed us whenever we passed her house. Her car slowed down when she saw Max in the yard. She even left a note on my door one evening that read, "This will not be tolerated." At first, I tried to brush it off. I wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding, that eventually she'd move on. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. And Mrs. Carter was about to learn that I wasn't someone she could push around. At first, I thought the letters were bad enough. But Mrs. Carter was just getting started. Within a few weeks, the situation escalated from annoying notices to full-blown harassment. One Saturday morning, as Max and I played fetch in the yard, I noticed her parked across the street in her silver sedan. She had the window rolled down, phone in hand, snapping pictures of Max every time he ran after the ball. I walked over, irritated. "Mrs. Carter, what exactly are you doing?" She didn't even look embarrassed. "Documenting violations," she said flatly, clicking another photo. "This will be brought up at the next HOA meeting." I couldn't believe it. Violations? He's playing in my yard. That's not against the rules. She sniffed, clearly enjoying the control. "We'll see what the board has to say." Then she rolled up her window and drove off like she had won some kind of battle. The following week, the fine started. First it was $50 for unauthorized pet activity. Then $100 for ongoing violations. Each fine came with a sternly worded letter threatening legal action if I didn't pay. I knew she had no real basis for these charges, but it didn't stop the anxiety from creeping in. HOA battles were messy, and she had the advantage of position. To make matters worse, Mrs. Carter began spreading rumors. I overheard her telling one of my neighbors that Max had been aggressive toward children, which was absurd. Max was the gentlest dog anyone could meet, he'd sooner roll over for belly rubs than growl. But rumors are like weeds, once planted, they spread quickly. A few neighbors started avoiding me on our walks, pulling their kids away like Max was dangerous. That cut deep. I knew then that this wasn't just a simple disagreement. Mrs. Carter was trying to isolate me, to make me feel like an outsider in my own neighborhood. And in some ways, it was working. Every time I walked past her house, she'd be there, arms crossed, glaring as though I was breaking some sacred law. One evening, I found a bright orange notice taped to my door. Final warning, remove the pet within 14 days or further action will be taken. My blood boiled. She had no legal right to force me to get rid of Max, but she was pushing as hard as she could, hoping I would cave under the pressure. That night, as Max curled up at my feet, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her bully me into submission. If she wanted a fight, I would give her one, but on my terms. I started digging through the HOA bylaws myself, page by page, highlighter in hand. And the deeper I read, the clearer it became, Mrs. Carter wasn't just misinterpreting the rules, she was flat out lying. She had overstepped her authority. And if she thought I would roll over, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. That night, after putting Max's food bowl away and watching him settle into his usual spot at the foot of my bed, I sat down at my desk with the thick binder of HOA documents I had kept since moving in. At the time I bought the house, I had skimmed through the rules like everyone else, checking for the obvious things: no broken fences, keep your lawn neat, no loud parties after midnight. But I had never paid attention to the fine print about pets. Now, every page mattered. I flipped to Section 14, Article C, the rule Mrs. Carter had quoted in her letters. It didn't take long to spot the problem. The bylaw didn't ban dogs. It didn't even mention size restrictions. All it said was that pets must be reasonably controlled and that homeowners must ensure their animals did not create a nuisance. That was it. No maximum weight limits, no outright prohibition, nothing even close to what she claimed. Max had never caused a nuisance in his life. He didn't bark at night, didn't dig up lawns, and certainly never bit anyone. By every measure, I was in full compliance. So why was Mrs. Carter targeting me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't about Max. This was about power. Mrs. Carter enjoyed being the gatekeeper of the community, the person who could decide what was acceptable and what wasn't. Max was just her excuse to tighten her grip. But I wasn't about to hand her an easy victory. The next day, I called a friend of mine who happened to be a lawyer. I explained the situation, reading aloud from the bylaws. He chuckled. "She doesn't have a case," he said firmly. "The rules are on your side. She's bluffing, hoping you'll get scared and give in. Don't. If she tries to fine you, you can fight it. If she tries to take legal action, she'll lose." Hearing those words was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt confident. Still, I knew better than to go in unprepared. I began documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every note she left on my door. I even took photos of Max interacting with kids in the neighborhood, neighbors petting him, and his calm behavior in the yard. If Mrs. Carter wanted to paint him as a menace, I would make sure the truth told a very different story. I also started talking quietly to neighbors I trusted. Some of them admitted they thought Mrs. Carter was overstepping. A few even offered to back me up if it came to a meeting or a legal fight. The more support I gathered, the less isolated I felt. By the end of the week, I had a binder of my own, stuffed with evidence, notes, and highlighted passages from the HOA bylaws. I wasn't just defending Max anymore, I was standing up against a bully. And deep down, I knew the showdown was coming. Mrs. Carter thought she could scare me into obedience. But when the time came, she would realize I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. For a while, things were quiet. Too quiet. I had gathered my evidence, spoken to neighbors, and even consulted a lawyer. But Mrs. Carter wasn't the type to back down without a fight. The calm ended one Thursday evening when I came home to find a notice stuck not only on my front door but also in the mailboxes of every house on the street. In bold letters, it read, "Special Emergency HOA Meeting, Topic, Dangerous Pets in the Community." Underneath was a picture of Max, taken from across the street while he was lying in my yard. Someone, clearly Mrs. Carter, had circled his face in red ink again, like he was some kind of criminal. My stomach sank, but then anger quickly replaced the shock. She wasn't just targeting me privately anymore, she was dragging my dog's name through the mud in front of the entire community. That weekend, whispers turned into open conversations. Neighbors came by asking if Max had really bitten someone. Others defended me, insisting they had never seen Max act aggressively. The neighborhood felt split right down the middle, and Mrs. Carter was the one fueling the fire. When the night of the meeting arrived, I wasn't nervous, I was ready. I walked into the community hall with my binder tucked under my arm, Max's leash in my other hand. I didn't bring him inside, of course, but I wanted people to see his calm, wagging tail before I left him with a friend outside. The room buzzed with tension. Mrs. Carter sat at the front, gavel in hand, like a judge presiding over a trial. Her eyes gleamed when she saw me walk in, as if she had already won. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice sharp. "Tonight we are here to address a serious violation of our community's standards, an unauthorized and dangerous dog that threatens our safety." Gasps rippled through the room. I could see a few people nodding along, but others looked skeptical. I raised my hand. "With all due respect, Mrs. Carter, that's not true. There is no rule banning dogs. Section 14, Article C states only that pets must not create a nuisance. My dog, Max, has never done that." Her eyes flashed. "That's debatable. I've received multiple complaints." "From who?" I challenged. "Because every neighbor I've spoken to says Max is gentle. Many of them are here tonight and will gladly confirm it." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. Mrs. Carter's grip on her gavel tightened. I pulled out my binder and placed it on the table. "I've documented everything, your letters, the fines, even photographs proving Max's good behavior. I've also consulted a lawyer, who confirmed that your claims have no legal basis. You are misrepresenting the bylaws, Mrs. Carter, and using your position to bully homeowners." The room went silent. People turned to look at her, waiting for a response. For the first time, I saw her composure falter. That was the turning point. She had expected me to be intimidated, to roll over and surrender. Instead, I stood my ground with evidence, allies, and the truth on my side. And judging by the uneasy shifting of chairs and the whispers starting to spread, the tide of the neighborhood was turning against her. The tension in the room that night could have been cut with a knife. Every pair of eyes darted between me and Mrs. Carter as if the whole neighborhood had suddenly realized this wasn't just about a dog, it was about power. Mrs. Carter banged her gavel against the table. "Enough of this grandstanding," she snapped. "The board has already reviewed the matter, and the decision is final. The dog must be removed." I took a slow breath, opened my binder, and laid out copies of the bylaws I had highlighted. "With all due respect, Mrs. Carter, the board doesn't get to make up rules that don't exist. Section 14, Article C clearly states pets are permitted as long as they're reasonably controlled. Show me where it says dogs of Max's size are banned." She scowled, flipping through her own papers. Her voice rose with frustration. "The language is open to interpretation. Large dogs can easily become a nuisance. I've received multiple complaints about yours." "Complaints you won't name?" I countered. "Because the neighbors I've spoken to disagree. In fact," I gestured to the crowd, "several of them are here tonight." A woman in the back stood up. "I live next door," she said firmly. "That dog has never caused a problem. My kids play with him almost every day. If Max is a threat, then I guess my kids are lying." Another man chimed in. "I walk my dog past his yard all the time. Max is calmer than most pets around here. This is harassment, plain and simple." The room erupted in murmurs, people nodding, whispering, some even clapping lightly. Mrs. Carter's face turned crimson. I seized the moment. "And let's not forget the fines you've been issuing, fines with no legitimate basis in the bylaws. That's an abuse of authority. I've consulted a lawyer, and if this continues, I'll have no choice but to pursue legal action against both you and the HOA." That landed like a bomb. The board members sitting beside her shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carter, maybe we should review this further. If the bylaws don't explicitly prohibit his dog." Her glare shot daggers at him, but the damage was done. The spell she had cast over the neighborhood was breaking. "No," she snapped. "If we allow this, what's next? Pit bulls? Dangerous animals roaming free?" "Max is not dangerous," I said, my voice steady. "He's family. And I will not be intimidated into giving him up." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was enough, a handful of claps, supportive nods, and murmurs of agreement. For the first time, I wasn't standing alone. Mrs. Carter tried to regain control, pounding her gavel again, but the room wasn't with her anymore. The board announced they would postpone the decision to review the bylaws thoroughly. It was their way of saving face, but I knew the truth. I had won the first real battle. As I left the hall that night, Max wagged his tail when he saw me, completely unaware of the storm swirling around him. I knelt down, scratched behind his ears, and whispered, "We're not out of this yet, buddy. But we're getting closer." The showdown had exposed Mrs. Carter's weakness. And now, it was only a matter of time before her grip on the neighborhood slipped completely. The morning after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt different. For months, Mrs. Carter had ruled with an iron fist, and people treated her words like law. But now, there was a shift in the air, an uneasiness that clung to her authority like cracks in a once solid wall. I noticed it first when I went for my morning walk with Max. A few neighbors who had avoided me before now smiled and waved. One even stopped to scratch Max behind the ears. "He really is a sweetheart," she said softly, almost like she was confessing something forbidden. It was a small gesture, but to me, it was huge. The silence that Mrs. Carter had cultivated through intimidation was breaking. But Mrs. Carter wasn't ready to give up. Later that day, another letter appeared in my mailbox, this one more aggressive than ever. "Your behavior at last night's meeting was disruptive and hostile. Further insubordination will result in legal escalation." I almost laughed out loud. Insubordination? I wasn't her employee. I was a homeowner with the same rights as everyone else. Still, her words confirmed what I already knew. She was rattled. Over the next few days, her desperation became obvious. She patrolled the neighborhood more frequently, clipboard in hand, scribbling down supposed violations. One family got a warning for having their trash cans visible for more than an hour. Another was cited for a lawn ornament that was too large. It was clear she was trying to reassert her control. But instead of uniting the community behind her, she was pushing people away. Neighbors started whispering in clusters, voices low but filled with frustration. I overheard one man muttering, "She's gone too far this time." The breaking point came a week later at a casual neighborhood gathering. A few families had set up lawn chairs near the park, kids playing tag while adults shared snacks. Max trotted happily among them, tail wagging, soaking up the attention. Then Mrs. Carter arrived. She stormed over, waving her clipboard like a sword. "This is unacceptable. Dogs are not permitted at community events unless approved in advance." Everyone froze. All eyes turned to her, then to Max, who was calmly lying on the grass as a little girl braided flowers into his collar. Finally, one of the neighbors spoke up. "He's not hurting anyone, Mrs. Carter. Stop making everything a battle." Another chimed in. "Honestly, we're tired of these so-called rules. This isn't a community anymore, it's a dictatorship." Her face burned red as murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. For the first time, she wasn't just being challenged by me, she was being challenged by everyone. I stood up slowly, keeping my voice steady. "We've all had enough, Mrs. Carter. You've been misusing your position. It's time the board considered whether you should even be president." That was the moment the tide fully turned. The once untouchable HOA president suddenly looked small, her power crumbling right there in the park. She sputtered, threatened more consequences, then stormed off in a fury. But everyone knew the truth, the neighborhood wasn't afraid of her anymore. And that meant her days as president were numbered. The week after Mrs. Carter's outburst at the park felt like the beginning of the end for her reign. People who had once stayed silent now openly questioned her decisions. I could feel the tension every time I walked Max around the block. Neighbors would pull me aside to share their own frustrations, many of which had nothing to do with me or my dog. "She fined me for leaving my Christmas lights up too long," one neighbor complained. "She threatened us over our garden shed," another said, shaking his head. It became clear that Max wasn't the real issue, he was just the spark that lit the fire. Mrs. Carter had been bullying the entire community, and finally, people were ready to stand up. The HOA board announced another meeting, this time to address concerns regarding leadership. The wording was deliberately vague, but everyone knew what it meant. By then, I wasn't nervous at all. I had my evidence, I had my neighbors, and most importantly, I had the truth. When the night of the meeting came, the room was packed. More people showed up than I'd ever seen before. The atmosphere was electric, like everyone was waiting for a verdict. Mrs. Carter opened the session with her usual cold authority, but her voice lacked the confidence it once carried. She tried to dive into ongoing violations, but she was cut off almost immediately. One of the board members, Mr. Daniels, cleared his throat. Before we continue, we need to address the issue of leadership. We've had numerous complaints regarding the misuse of power and unfair enforcement of rules. Tonight, we'll allow the community to voice their concerns. And then it began. One by one, neighbors stood up. A young mother described how Mrs. Carter accused her son of damaging common property without proof. An elderly man recounted how she fined him for having a bird feeder. Another family revealed she had threatened legal action over the color of their front door. With each story, Mrs. Carter's face grew paler. She tried to interrupt, but the board silenced her. For once, she wasn't in control. Finally, it was my turn. I stood, holding Max's leash as he sat calmly by my side outside the doorway. For months, Mrs. Carter has tried to force me to remove my dog based on rules that don't exist. She's issued false fines, spread rumors, and harassed me in front of my neighbors. But this isn't just about me, it's about every single person here who's been mistreated. This community deserves better. The room erupted in applause. People weren't clapping just for me, they were clapping because they finally felt free to speak the truth. The board called for a vote. Hands shot up all across the room, faster than I could count. The decision was unanimous. Mrs. Carter was to be removed as HOA president effective immediately. She stood there, trembling with fury, her gavel still clutched in her hand. But the authority it once symbolized was gone. With a bitter scowl, she slammed it down one last time and stormed out of the room. Justice had been served. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like a community again. The night Mrs. Carter was voted out as HOA president felt like a victory not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood. Yet, as I walked home with Max trotting happily by my side, I couldn't help but think about everything that had happened over the past few months. It hadn't been easy. There were nights I lost sleep worrying about losing him, mornings I dreaded checking the mailbox, and days I wondered if standing up to her was worth the stress. But as I scratched behind Max's ears and felt his tail thump against my leg, I knew the answer. It was worth every second. Max wasn't just a dog, he was family. And family isn't something you give up on, not when someone tries to bully you into surrendering. That was the first lesson I learned through this ordeal. You have to protect what matters most, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. The second lesson was about community. For so long, Mrs. Carter had ruled by intimidation, making everyone feel small and powerless. I had believed I was fighting her alone, but I wasn't. My neighbors were frustrated too, they just needed someone to stand up first. Once I did, others found their voices. And together, we changed things. It made me realize how often people stay silent, not because they agree with the bully, but because they're afraid of the consequences. One act of courage can inspire others to step forward. The third lesson was about power itself. Mrs. Carter had abused hers, twisting the HOA rules to serve her own agenda. She thought her title made her untouchable. But power built on fear doesn't last forever. Eventually, people see through it. What truly matters is fairness, respect, and honesty. Without those, authority crumbles. Over the following days, I noticed the difference everywhere. Neighbors waved more often, kids laughed more freely, and conversations no longer had that edge of fear about what Mrs. Carter would say. The new board members promised to review the rules openly, with input from the community, instead of enforcing them like a dictator. Slowly, our neighborhood began to feel like a home again, not just a collection of houses bound by paperwork, but a place where people actually cared for one another. And through it all, Max remained the same, gentle, loyal, and blissfully unaware of the drama he had sparked. He still greeted kids on our walks, still chased his ball across the yard, still curled up by my feet each night. To him, nothing had changed. But to me, everything had. As I looked out across my street one evening, watching neighbors chat on their porches while Max rested his head on my lap, I felt a quiet kind of pride. We had faced down a bully and won. Not just for me, not just for Max, but for everyone who believed in standing up for what's right. And that, I realized, was the greatest lesson of all. The weeks following Mrs. Carter's removal were some of the most peaceful I had experienced since moving into the neighborhood. Without her constant patrols, clipboard in hand, the air felt lighter. People actually smiled when they passed each other on the street. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started chatting over fences, and kids played outside without fear of being scolded for something trivial. It was as though the whole community had taken a deep breath and finally exhaled. Max, of course, reveled in the change. With no one glaring at him from across the street or snapping secret photos, he was free to be himself again. He ran in the yard, wagged his tail at everyone we passed, and rolled in the grass without a care in the world. Seeing him happy made me realize just how much stress Mrs. Carter's crusade had caused, not just for me, but for him too. Dogs feel what we feel, and Max had been carrying my tension all along. Now, he was back to his old joyful self, and it was contagious. The new HOA board quickly got to work rebuilding trust. Instead of issuing threats and fines, they held open forums where residents could voice concerns. They even organized community events designed to bring people together, barbecues, family movie nights, and volunteer projects to improve the park. At the first official gathering, several neighbors came up to me to thank me for standing my ground. "You showed us we don't have to just accept things when they're wrong," one said. "You gave us the courage to speak up," another added. I wasn't used to being the center of that kind of attention, but it warmed me to know that something I did for Max ended up making life better for everyone. And as for Mrs. Carter? She kept a low profile after her removal. Rumor had it she was still bitter, but without her title, she was just another resident. People said she rarely left her house except for errands, and when she did, her presence no longer carried the same weight. Her gavel, once a symbol of power, was nothing more than a memory. One evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. Max lay beside me, his head resting on my foot, his golden coat glowing in the last rays of daylight. The sound of laughter drifted from across the street where kids played tag, their parents chatting in lawn chairs. The neighborhood had changed, it finally felt like a community, not a battlefield. I leaned down and whispered to Max, "We did it, buddy." His tail thumped in response, as if he understood every word. In that moment, I realized something important. The real victory wasn't just keeping Max or removing Mrs. Carter from power, it was reclaiming the sense of home that had been missing for so long. A home isn't just walls and a roof. It's peace, safety, and the freedom to live happily with the ones you love. And for me, that home would always include Max.